Welcome to my channel. Welcome to that channel.
The Ghost of Dunvegan Castle vertical bar, a Hamish Macbeth mystery. Morning drifted into Lockdown the way gossip usually did. Softly, without announcement, and impossible to stop once it had begun. Mist floated over the narrow sea loch, wrapping itself around the dark hills until the mountains appeared to be rising from clouds instead of earth. The gulls complained noisily over the harbour, while sheep regarded the weather with their customary expression of mild disappointment. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth considered it a morning of rare perfection. That was because absolutely nothing appeared to require his attention. He stood knee-deep beside the river that fed into the loch, an old fishing rod balanced lazily in one hand. Officially, he was inspecting erosion along the banks after recent rains. Unofficially, he was hoping one of the fat salmon eyeing him from beneath the current would develop suicidal tendencies. His great dog Lugs sprawled on the grass nearby, snoring with such determination that the sound startled passing birds. Hamish glanced up at the pale Highland sky. "If headquarters rings," he said conversationally to the dog, "we're no here." Lugs thumped his tail without opening an eye. A mobile telephone buzzed inside Hamish's jacket. He looked at it as though it were an unusually poisonous spider. The display announced, "STRATBANE Police HQ." Hamish sighed deeply. "It'll only spoil the morning." The telephone continued vibrating. Eventually it stopped. Peace returned. "There," Hamish said. "Problem solved." He reeled in exactly nothing, and decided that even catching fish involved more effort than he was prepared to expend. The Lockdown Hotel smelled pleasantly of coffee, frying bacon, and polished wood. Hamish preferred it to the police station. Mrs. McLean, who had managed the hotel long enough to survive tourists, politicians, and 3 unfortunate marriages, poured him an enormous mug before he had even sat down. "You've been avoiding work again. I resent the accusation. You've still got your waders on." Hamish looked down. "So I have. You planning on arresting a salmon?" It was resisting questioning. She snorted. Outside the large windows, Lockdown moved at its customary pace. Mrs. Wellington walked her geese. The minister bicycled carefully down the main street while avoiding chickens that considered traffic regulations beneath them. Old Angus Sinclair had already established himself outside the village shop where he could monitor everyone else's business under the guise of discussing weather. Nothing remarkable. Exactly the way Hamish liked it. He wrapped both hands around the steaming mug. He had barely taken the first satisfying sip when the piece shattered. Not with an explosion, with an engine. A long, expensive black motorcar rolled into the village like royalty arriving by mistake. Every conversation stopped. Curtains twitched. Even the gulls seemed offended. Mrs. McLean looked through the window. "Oh dear. What?" "It's English." Hamish looked. "It is at that." The car gleamed despite the muddy roads. London registration. Enough chrome to blind aircraft. It halted outside the hotel. The driver emerged first. A compact man wearing an immaculate chauffeur's uniform. He hurried to open the rear door. Out stepped a woman who seemed entirely inappropriate for the Highlands. She wore cream-colored cashmere, despite the damp wind, oversized sunglasses despite the absence of sunshine, and shoes that had clearly never encountered mud before. She surveyed Lockdown the way one might inspect an elderly relative's attic, with disappointment. "Good heavens," she announced loudly. "Is this really it?" Silence spread across the street. Hamish took another slow sip of coffee. Never interrupt an English visitor making a bad first impression. They rarely required assistance. The chauffeur attempted optimism. "The scenery is rather splendid, madam. If one likes bleakness," Mrs. Wellington's geese hissed. Hamish suspected they possessed excellent judgment. The newcomer marched into the hotel, without removing her sunglasses, without smiling, without acknowledging anyone. She placed a leather glove upon the reception desk as though laying down evidence. "I have a reservation." Mrs. McLean smiled pleasantly. "Name?" Lady Veronica Ashcombe lowered her sunglasses. "You mean you don't know who I am?" "No." A pause. "I find that astonishing." McLean continued smiling. "We dinna get astonished much. I own Dunvegan Castle." Several villagers exchanged puzzled glances. Old Angus whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Does she?" Hamish looked mildly interested. Dunvegan Castle had stood empty for years. It wasn't truly a castle anymore. More an oversized, crumbling manor perched dramatically on cliffs overlooking the sea. Generations of owners had purchased it with grand dreams before discovering that ancient Highland estates consumed fortunes faster than drunken sailors. The place had acquired stories, ghosts, disappearances. One unfortunate American millionaire had claimed to hear weeping every night before fleeing after exactly 12 days. The locals generally agreed that if the castle contained ghosts, they were probably embarrassed by the decorating. Lady Veronica continued, "I've purchased it as part of an exclusive restoration." Mrs. McLean nodded politely. "Have ye now? It will become Scotland's premier luxury historical experience." Nobody spoke. Lady Veronica mistook the silence for admiration. "There'll be helicopter access." Someone coughed. "A spa." The minister blinked. "A private members' club." Mrs. Wellington frowned. "And, naturally, the village will require modernization." That word settled over the room like a bad smell. Hamish watched faces carefully. He had learned years ago that Highlanders rarely argued immediately. They remembered, quietly, thoroughly, forever. Old Angus finally asked, "Modernization?" Lady Veronica smiled the sort of smile generally associated with tax collectors. "The quaintness is charming, of course, but one cannot expect distinguished visitors to tolerate livestock wandering the roads." Mrs. Wellington folded her arms. "The sheep were here first. They'll have to adapt." Nobody answered. Hamish noticed Mrs. McLean refill his coffee without being asked. That usually meant trouble had arrived. Lady Veronica continued enthusiastically, "I've already spoken to solicitors about acquiring several neighboring cottages." Another silence. One of those cottages belonged to Mrs. Wellington. Another belonged to Angus. Another to the postmistress. Hamish filed the information away, not because he suspected crime, because villagers remembered threats longer than promises. Lady Veronica turned toward him. "You." Hamish looked behind himself. "No, you." He smiled pleasantly. "I? You appear local. So folk tell me. I'm looking for the constable." Hamish scratched lugs behind the ears. "Haven't seen him." Mrs. McLean coughed loudly into a tea towel. Lady Veronica frowned. "I was informed the village has a police officer." "It does. Where is he?" Hamish considered the matter. "Probably having coffee. I need him immediately." "What for?" "There are people trespassing on my land. Already. They claim they possess ancient rights of way." "They probably do." "Nonsense." Hamish looked genuinely sympathetic. "The Highlands are terrible for ancient rights." Lady Veronica stared. "I don't believe you appreciate the seriousness." "Oh, I do. I shall expect immediate police action." Hamish nodded thoughtfully. "I'll pass that along." She marched upstairs. The moment she disappeared, conversation erupted. "I give her 3 days," said Mrs. Wellington. 2, said Angus. "The castle ghosts will have her packed before Friday." Mrs. McLean looked toward Hamish. "Well." Hamish sipped his coffee. "What? You've not said anything." "No point." "You've noticed something." He smiled faintly. "Aye." "What?" "She's frightened." Everyone looked surprised. "Frightened?" asked the minister. "Of what?" Hamish stared out toward the distant cliffs where Dunvegan Castle stood hidden by drifting mist. "I've no idea." He paused. "But folk who try that hard to look important usually are." Outside, the wind strengthened. Far across the loch, somewhere beyond the grey rain clouds gathering around the abandoned castle, a raven called once. Then again. Lugs lifted his head, ears twitching uneasily. Hamish noticed. Dogs often noticed things before people did. He finished the last of his coffee. It was shaping up to be one of those days, which was a pity. He had been hoping to catch a salmon. Hamish lingered over his empty mug, long after everyone else had found a reason to drift closer to the windows. In Lochdu, curiosity possessed remarkable stamina. It could stand comfortably for hours, provided tea appeared at sensible intervals. Lady Veronica had not reappeared. Instead, her chauffeur returned to the motorcar, extracted an alarming quantity of expensive luggage, and carried it upstairs with the resigned expression of a man who had spent years transporting other people's impossible expectations. Hamish watched him through half-lidded eyes. The chauffeur moved carefully, almost silently. His clothes were immaculate, but his shoulders drooped whenever Lady Veronica was out of sight. Interesting. People who served tyrants often knew where the bodies were buried. Not literally, Hamish hoped. Mrs. McLean leaned across the counter. "You'll have to go and see her." "I was hoping she'd leave first." "She won't." "I could wait until tomorrow." "She's already asking where the policeman is." Hamish sighed as though facing extraordinary hardship. "I suppose I'd better become him." He rose reluctantly, stretched with theatrical weariness, and wandered upstairs. Lady Veronica's suite overlooked the loch. The curtains had already been thrown open despite the threatening weather. She stood beside the window, speaking sharply into a telephone. "No." I don't care what the survey says. If the villagers object, buy them out. If they still object, speak to the council. She noticed Hamish in the doorway. Call you back. The telephone disappeared into an elegant handbag. You took your time. Are you the constable? I am. She looked disappointed. Hamish was accustomed to that reaction. Tall, loose-limbed, with red hair badly in need of a comb, and the expression of someone perpetually wondering whether another cup of coffee might improve matters, he inspired confidence in almost nobody from outside the Highlands. I'm Police Constable Hamish Macbeth. You don't look much like a policeman, so I'm often told. She sat gracefully in an armchair. I require assistance. What seems to be the trouble? She produced a folded map. The boundaries of my estate. Hamish unfolded it. Neat red lines enclosed woods, cliffs, grazing land and the crumbling castle. She tapped impatiently. There are footpaths crossing my property. They've always been footpaths. They're closed now. Did the paths agree? Her lips tightened. I've purchased the land. Therefore it belongs to me. Hamish examined the map instead of her. Some rights of way are older than either of us. I don't believe in medieval nonsense. The law occasionally does. She dismissed that with a wave. There are fishermen, hikers and photographers wandering wherever they please. Tourists? Worse. Locals? She nodded. They behave as though the place belongs to them. Hamish looked out toward the distant outline of Dunvegan Castle. In a fashion they think it does. She laughed without amusement. Sentimental rubbish. He folded the map carefully. I'll have a word if anyone's causing trouble. I expect more than words. You may. Whether she interpreted that as agreement or warning was difficult to tell. Before he reached the door, she spoke again. Constable. He turned. Have you ever heard stories about the castle? Several hundred. Ghost stories. Mostly. She hesitated. For the first time her confidence slipped. Someone has been walking the corridors at night. The castle's empty. It wasn't last night. You stayed there? One night. And? I heard footsteps. Old buildings settle. They don't laugh. Hamish remained quiet. She looked annoyed with herself. I don't believe in ghosts. Neither do I. There was someone inside. Did you see them? No. Anything missing? She hesitated again. No. No damage? No. Then perhaps someone wanted you to think the castle haunted. She studied him. You really don't believe ghost stories. I've found people considerably stranger. Her expression softened almost imperceptibly. You're not quite as foolish as you appear. I've been practicing. Outside, rain finally arrived, striking the windows in fine silver sheets. By the time Hamish descended to the street, Loch Dew had retreated beneath umbrellas and waterproof coats. Lugs bounded happily through puddles, unconcerned by weather that would have discouraged most civilized creatures. Hamish decided the castle deserved a visit. Not because of ghosts, because someone wealthy enough to purchase Dunvegan Castle had admitted being frightened. People rarely volunteered fear unless it had already become impossible to ignore. The road climbed steadily above the village, twisting between purple heather and scattered pines. Rain drifted sideways on the wind. The castle emerged slowly from the mist. It stood on a rocky headland above the sea, its grey stone darkened by centuries of rain. One tower leaned ever so slightly. Ivy had claimed much of the western wall, while broken chimneys pointed accusingly at the clouds. It looked less haunted than neglected. Neglect could explain many things. The front gates stood open. Fresh tire tracks cut through the gravel. So did something else. Hamish crouched. Boot prints. Several pairs, some recent, one much older, softened by earlier rain. He followed them toward the entrance. The great oak door hung ajar. Inside, the air smelled of damp stone, old wood and sea salt. His footsteps echoed through the entrance hall. Lugs. The dog trotted ahead, nose working busily. A faded portrait watched them from above the staircase. One eye had peeled away with age, lending the unfortunate gentleman an expression of permanent suspicion. Hamish smiled faintly. You've seen better days. The silence answered him. He wandered through room after room. Dust-covered furniture beneath white sheets. Broken plaster littered the floors. Recent footprints crossed the dust in several directions. Workman. Lady Veronica. Someone wearing narrow boots. Then Lugs stopped. The dog's ears stiffened. A low growl rolled from his chest. What is it? Lugs sniffed at the floor beside the grand staircase. Hamish knelt. There, lying against the skirting board, almost hidden beneath a loose strip of carpet, was a woman's silk scarf, expensive, dark green. One corner had been torn cleanly away. He picked it up. It carried a faint perfume, not Lady Veronica's. He remembered the sharp floral scent she'd worn at the hotel. This was different. Something lighter. Someone else had been inside, recently. Before he could examine it further, a sound echoed faintly from the upper floor. Not footsteps, a door closing, slowly, very softly. Hamish did not move. Instead, he listened. Silence returned. Most policemen would have hurried upstairs. Hamish knew better. People who believed they had gone unnoticed often made mistakes. He waited. Nearly 2 full minutes passed. Then, somewhere above him, floorboards creaked once. Not the shifting of old timber, the careful weight of a person trying not to be heard. Hamish looked toward the staircase, his expression as lazy and unconcerned as ever. Inside, however, his mind had become perfectly alert. The castle, it seemed, was not haunted after all. It simply had visitors, who preferred to remain invisible. The rain had eased by the time the faint creak sounded again. It was followed by a silence so complete that Hamish could hear water dripping steadily from a crack somewhere high in the ceiling. Luggs remained motionless, his amber eyes fixed upon the shadowed landing above. Hamish slipped the green silk scarf into the pocket of his waterproof jacket. "There now," he murmured to the dog. "No sense in alarming whoever's up there." He did not hurry toward the staircase. Instead, he wandered into what had once been the drawing room, examining cracked plaster and rain-stained walls, with the detached interest of a man who had forgotten why he had come. Anyone watching would conclude that the village constable was exactly as slow-witted as gossip suggested. Only after several minutes did he drift back into the hall. The upper landing was empty. The front door, however, moved ever so slightly in the breeze. Someone had left. Outside, the wet gravel told the tale. A fresh set of narrow boot prints led away from the house, not toward the road, but around the western side of the castle, where the cliffs overlooked the sea. Hamish followed at an unhurried pace. The path wound through dripping gorse bushes until it reached the edge of the cliffs. Far below, grey waves crashed against black rocks, throwing white spray high into the air. Seabirds circled noisily beneath the overcast sky. No one was in sight. The boot prints ended at the edge of a patch of long grass. From there, only sheep tracks remained. Hamish frowned. People rarely vanished into thin Highland air. He searched quietly until Luggs barked once and pawed at a clump of heather. Hidden beneath it was a narrow stone stairway descending between the cliffs. Well now, the steps were ancient, uneven, and almost invisible from above. He descended carefully. The stair ended at a tiny cove where an old stone boathouse leaned against the rock face. Half its roof had collapsed years before, and green moss covered the remaining slates. The wooden door stood slightly open. Hamish pushed it wider. Inside rested an abandoned fishing boat, several rotten lobster creels, and a surprising number of fresh footprints in the damp sand. Someone had been using the place. Very recently. On the floor lay a cigarette butt. Hamish picked it up. It was expensive, not the sort usually smoked by Lockdhu fishermen. Beside it he found something even more interesting, a folded receipt. Rain had blurred part of the ink, but enough remained to read. MacLeod Marine Fuel, Portree. Yesterday's date. Paid in cash. There was no boat in the cove, which meant whoever had visited had arrived by sea and departed again. Luggs sniffed around the walls before stopping beside an old wooden crate. Hamish lifted the lid. Empty. Yet the sand beneath it remained dry. Something heavy had rested there until very recently. He replaced the lid exactly as he had found it. Better not to let anyone know their hiding place had been discovered. As he climbed back toward the castle, the clouds finally broke, allowing weak afternoon sunlight to spill across the sea. The Highlands could change their mood in moments. People, Hamish reflected, usually took longer. By the time he returned to Lockdhu, word had spread that Lady Veronica had already begun offending half the village. At Patel's village shop, Mrs. Wellington was recounting the latest outrage with enormous satisfaction. She told Donald McCrae his sheep spoil the view. Donald looked genuinely bewildered. They're sheep. I know. They've always been sheep. Apparently they should graze somewhere less visible. General laughter filled the shop. Hamish bought a loaf of bread he did not need, mostly to justify standing there. What else? He asked. Angus Sinclair lowered his newspaper. She's hired workmen from Inverness. Not local. Claims local builders are too slow. That earned another chorus of disapproval. Mrs. Patel emerged from the back room carrying fresh scones. She also asked if we could import different seagulls. The shop fell silent. Hamish blinked. Different? Quieter ones. Even Hamish laughed. You'll manage that. No. They belong to themselves. The laughter eased some of the tension, but Hamish noticed something beneath it. Nobody merely disliked Lady Veronica. Some genuinely resented her. That could become dangerous. As he stepped outside with lugs at his heels, he nearly collided with Elspeth Grant. The young reporter carried a notebook beneath one arm and wore the determined expression that usually meant she had scented a story before anyone else. "I've been looking everywhere for you. So I've been hiding well. You've been up at the castle. Have I? Oh, don't start that." She folded her arms. "I've spoken to 3 builders, and one resigned before lunch. Fast worker. He said the owner kept asking about ghosts." Hamish's eyebrows lifted. "Ghosts again?" Elspeth nodded. "Apparently she isn't telling people the whole story." "What whole story?" "She claims she bought the castle because of its history. And," Elspeth lowered her voice, "the estate agent told one of the builders she specifically wanted the room known as the Grey Chamber." Hamish stopped walking. "The Grey Chamber. You've heard of it?" "Everyone around here has. It was the oldest room in Dunvegan Castle. Local legend insisted that centuries earlier, a clan chief had hidden something valuable there before disappearing at sea. No one agreed on what the treasure had been. Gold, Jacobite papers, smuggled jewels. Every generation invented a different answer. No one had ever found anything. At least, not officially. Elspeth watched his face carefully. "You don't believe in hidden treasure?" "No. But you think Lady Veronica does." Hamish looked back toward the distant cliffs where the ruined castle stood against the evening sky. "I think," he said slowly, "that nobody spends millions restoring a crumbling castle just because they enjoy damp walls. And if she wasn't looking for ghosts, she may have been looking for something else entirely." As if summoned by the thought, a dark Land Rover sped into the village square, spraying muddy water across the road. It stopped outside the hotel. 3 men climbed out. None looked like builders. They wore expensive outdoor jackets, carried no luggage, and immediately scanned the village instead of admiring it. The tallest caught Hamish watching. Their eyes met for only a second. Then the stranger smiled politely. It was the sort of smile that revealed absolutely nothing. Hamish had seen it before, usually on people with something to hide. The 3 men entered the hotel without a word to anyone. The door swung shut behind them, and the ordinary sounds of lockdo gradually returned. The clatter of milk bottles outside the shop, the distant bleating of sheep, and the steady conversation that never quite stopped in a Highland village. Hamish remained where he was. Elspeth followed his gaze. "Friends of Lady Veronica? Maybe. You don't sound convinced." "I'm not." The tallest of the newcomers had moved like a man accustomed to watching exits before entering rooms. The second had rough, weathered hands that suggested hard physical work despite his expensive clothes. The third carried himself stiffly, favoring his left leg ever so slightly. Little things were usually worth remembering. "I'll go and ask," Elspeth said brightly. Hamish smiled. "You'll do no such thing." "Why not?" "They'll expect questions from a reporter. So, they'll prepare answers." She sighed dramatically. "You always spoil my fun." "I try." She grinned despite herself and walked toward the newspaper office. Hamish scratched lugs behind the ears. "Come on." Instead of entering the hotel, he wandered around to the side yard, where the kitchen deliveries were made. Mrs. McLean was supervising a boy unloading crates of vegetables. "Evening, Hamish." "Evening." She wiped her hands on her apron. "You've seen them? The visitors?" "Aye. They arrived asking for Lady Veronica before they'd even taken their coats off." "Names?" She frowned. "Only one signed the register. And Mr. Adrian Pierce, London address. Just 1 room." "No, 3. Hamish nodded. People traveling together usually booked together. People wanting to appear unconnected, often booked separately. "Anything else, Mrs. Woodall?" McLean lowered her voice. "They asked whether anyone had been up at the castle today." Hamish looked mildly surprised. "What did you tell them?" "The truth." "Oh. I said half the village wanders up there sooner or later." He smiled. "Good answer. I've had practice." She hesitated. "There's something else." "What?" "When Lady Veronica came back from the castle this afternoon, she wasn't alone." "Who was with her?" "I don't know." "A man." She shook her head. "A woman." Hamish's interest sharpened. "I only saw her from behind. Dark coat, about my height. She didn't come into the hotel." "What happened?" "They argued outside." "Could you hear?" "No. But," Mrs. McLean frowned, "the woman threw something at Lady Veronica." "What?" "I couldn't see. And then she walked away toward the harbour." Hamish thanked her and headed downhill. The harbour was quiet except for old Archie McBride repairing lobster pots beside his fishing boat. Archie rarely missed anything. He simply preferred making people believe he had. Hamish sat on an overturned crate. Evening. Aye. Catching much? Eventually. They watched the water for a minute. Archie spoke first. You're after the woman. Hamish smiled. So you've seen her. Tall enough. Dark coat. Aye. Where'd she go? Asked about hiring a boat. Did she? I told her no one sensible was going out in that weather. Was she disappointed? No. What then? She stood looking toward the castle for 10 minutes. And after that, walked away. Direction. Old cemetery. Hamish looked up. The cemetery lay beyond the kirk, overlooking the loch, an unusual place for a stranger. What age? 40, maybe. English? No. Scottish. Archie shrugged. Spoke very little. Hamish stood. Thanks. Archie continued repairing his creels. She was crying. Hamish paused. You didn't mention that. You didn't ask. The cemetery overlooked the sea from a low hill behind the whitewashed kirk. Ancient gravestones leaned at odd angles, their inscriptions softened by centuries of wind and rain. Lugs wandered respectfully between them. Hamish searched slowly. No woman. But near the oldest wall he noticed fresh footprints pressed into the damp earth. Beside them lay wilted white lilies. Someone had placed them against a weathered headstone. He brushed away moss until the inscription became readable. Isobel McCrae, 1939, 1998. Beneath the dates, someone had recently left a small polished stone. Not a Highland custom. Hamish straightened. Why would an unknown woman visit a forgotten grave before meeting Lady Veronica? He was still considering the question when the minister approached through the gate carrying a watering can. Evening, Hamish. Evening. The minister noticed the grave. Ah, you know who was here? This afternoon. The woman? Yes. Did she say anything? Asked whether Mrs. McCrae still had family. And? I told her the daughter moved south years ago. Daughter's name? The minister thought for a moment. Fiona. Married? I believe so. To whom? I'm afraid I can't remember. Hamish thanked him and walked back toward the village. The name meant nothing. Yet, names had a habit of becoming useful later. Night settled early beneath heavy clouds. Rain returned, tapping gently against the windows of the police station. Hamish fed lugs, lit the small stove, and put a pot of stew on to warm. The station smelled pleasantly of peat smoke and onions. He spread the day's observations across his desk, not on paper, but in his mind. Lady Veronica frightened, unknown woman, green silk scarf, hidden boathouse, visitors arriving separately, the grey chamber, an old grave. None of it fitted together. Not yet. There came a sharp knock at the door. Without waiting for permission, the tallest of the three strangers stepped inside. He removed his cap politely. Constable Macbeth. Aye. I'm Adrian Pierce. So I've heard. Pierce smiled easily. I hope I'm not disturbing your evening. You are. I'll be brief. He glanced around the modest station before his eyes settled on Hamish. I understand you've been exploring Dunvegan Castle. I walk about. So I've been told. His smile never changed. I wonder if you found anything unusual. Hamish leaned back lazily. Depends what you call unusual. A green silk scarf, perhaps? For the first time that day, Hamish felt the smallest chill that had nothing to do with the Highland weather. He had told no one about the scarf. No one. Which meant only one thing. Someone had been watching him inside the castle. Hamish did not answer immediately. He reached instead for the kettle resting on the little stove. It'll be another minute before the water boils. Adrian Pierce looked faintly puzzled. I beg your pardon. For tea. I didn't ask for tea. I know. Hamish lifted 2 mugs from the shelf. But you're here now. Visitors from outside the Highlands often mistook hospitality for absent-mindedness. It wasn't. Tea had a useful habit of making impatient people talk. Pierce remained standing. I really only came to ask a question. So you did. Hamish spooned tea into the pot with leisurely care. Lugs lay in front of the stove, one eye half open, watching the stranger. I'll ask again, Pierce said pleasantly. Did you happen to find a green silk scarf? Hamish looked up. Should I have? For the briefest instant, disappointment crossed Pierce's face before the polite smile returned. It belongs to a friend. Careless of them. Quite. Hamish poured the boiling water. Milk? No. Sugar? No. Pierce accepted the mug anyway. He looked like a man accustomed to expensive coffee bars rather than chipped police mugs, but he drank without complaint. Interesting. I gather Lady Veronica mentioned ghosts, Hamish said. Pierce gave a short laugh. She's becoming rather obsessed. You don't believe her? I believe old buildings make strange noises. So do I. Pierce relaxed slightly. Then we're in agreement. Hamish nodded. Though old buildings rarely wear silk scarves. The smile vanished. Only for a heartbeat. But Hamish saw it. Pierce recovered quickly. I suppose not. Silence settled between them. Rain tapped steadily against the window. Finally Pierce set down his mug. If you do happen to find one, I'd appreciate its return. I'm sure you would. He reached the door before speaking again. Constable. I'd advise against wandering around the castle alone. Hamish looked mildly surprised. Ghosts? There are dangerous places. So I've noticed. Pierce inclined his head politely and disappeared into the rainy night. The moment the door closed, Luggs stood and gave a low growl. Hamish stared into the fire. You didn't like him. The dog snorted. Neither did I. The following morning dawned cold and brilliantly clear. The storm had washed the air so thoroughly that every mountain stood sharp against a sky of pale blue. Hamish walked to the hotel for breakfast. Half the village had apparently reached the same destination. Mrs. McLean moved between tables carrying plates of eggs, bacon, and black pudding, while simultaneously collecting every scrap of gossip within earshot. Angus Sinclair waved Hamish over. Sit down. Hamish did. You've heard? Heard what? Work stopped at the castle. Hamish buttered a slice of toast. Why? Lady Veronica ordered everyone out. Mrs. Wellington leaned across from the next table. One of the builders refused to go back inside. Did he say why? He claims he saw a woman walking through a wall. General murmurs followed. Hamish sipped his coffee. What was he drinking? Mrs. Wellington looked offended. Tea. Strong tea. Oh, stop it, she snapped. The poor man's terrified. The hotel door opened. A young builder entered, pale-faced and visibly exhausted. His waterproof jacket was streaked with mud. Mrs. McLean guided him toward a chair. You look dreadful. I feel worse. Hamish carried his coffee over. Morning. The young man looked up nervously. You're the policeman. So they tell me. I've had enough. Of Lady Veronica. Of that place. Hamish sat opposite him. What happened? The builder rubbed both hands over his face. I was working in the west corridor. Alone? No, there were 3 of us. And? I heard someone singing. What sort of singing? I couldn't make out the words. Did the others hear it? One did. The other? He'd gone outside. Hamish nodded. What happened next? I followed the sound. Why? I thought one of the lads was playing a joke. Was he? The builder swallowed. No. What did you find? The grey chamber. Hamish remained expressionless. The door was open. And? There was a woman standing by the fireplace. What did she look like? I couldn't really see. Why not? The sun was behind her. He shivered despite the warmth of the room. I called out. What did she do? Nothing. You walked closer? Aye. And then? She disappeared. Nobody spoke. Even Angus had stopped pretending to read his newspaper. Hamish finally asked, Did you search the room? Of course. No one there. No. No hidden door. I looked. Hamish thanked him and returned to his breakfast. Mrs. Wellington stared. Well? Well what? Do you think he imagined it? Hamish spread marmalade across another piece of toast. I think he believes what he saw. That's not the same thing. No. Just before noon, Hamish decided to inspect the grey chamber himself, again. This time, however, he approached from the rear of the castle. The hidden stairway to the old boathouse remained undisturbed. Inside, nothing had changed, except for one thing. The crate was gone. Someone had removed it during the night. In its place lay deep drag marks, leading toward the sea. Hamish crouched. The tide had erased every footprint beyond the doorway. Convenient. Very convenient. He climbed back toward the castle. The builders were gathered outside smoking nervously. None seemed eager to re-enter. Lady Veronica stood on the front steps arguing with Adrian Pierce. I'm telling you, it isn't here. Pierce answered quietly. You said it had to be. I was assured. So was I. They stopped talking as Hamish approached. Lady Veronica forced a smile. Constable. Lady Veronica. I trust you've solved our ghost problem. I've only just arrived. She laughed too loudly. Perhaps you could persuade my workmen to stop believing in fairy tales. Hamish looked at the builders. Anyone hurt? They shook their heads. No. Then there's no law against being frightened. Lady Veronica's patience snapped. This is costing me thousands of pounds every hour. Hamish nodded sympathetically. That must be difficult. She stared at him in disbelief. Pierce stepped smoothly between them. Perhaps the constable would like to inspect the grey chamber. I was thinking that. I'll accompany you. No need. I insist. Hamish smiled. I don't. For a long second, neither man moved. Then Pierce stepped aside. As you wish. Hamish climbed the broad staircase alone. The grey chamber lay at the end of a long corridor lined with faded portraits. The room itself was almost empty. A vast fireplace, broken oak panels, tall windows overlooking the sea. Nothing more. He wandered slowly around the walls. Dust covered most of the floor, except near the fireplace. Someone had recently swept the area, clean. Not thoroughly. Just enough to hide something. Hamish knelt. A tiny fragment of stone protruded between the flagstones. He pressed it. Nothing happened. He smiled faintly. Old houses rarely surrendered secrets on the first attempt. He examined the fireplace instead. One side of the carved mantel showed less wear than the other. Years of observation had taught him that people unconsciously touched hidden catches. He rested his hand there. Gently pushed. A dull click echoed through the room. Behind him, one section of oak paneling shifted outward by barely an inch. A concealed door. Hamish opened it slowly. A narrow stone passage disappeared into darkness. The air that drifted out smelled stale, untouched, or so it seemed. Then he noticed it. Not 20 feet inside the passage, lying on the dusty floor, was a modern electric torch, still glowing faintly. Someone had been down there, very recently, and, judging by the weakening beam, they had left in a hurry. Hamish stood perfectly still at the entrance to the hidden passage. There was always a temptation, on discovering something concealed, to hurry forward before the moment passed. He had learned long ago that haste usually benefited the person who had something to hide. Instead, he listened. The old castle answered with silence. No footsteps, no breathing. Only the distant cry of gulls filtering faintly through the stone. Lugs padded quietly into the grey chamber and stopped beside him. The dog sniffed the stale air, then looked up expectantly. Aye, Hamish murmured. We'll have a wee look. The passage was narrow enough that his shoulders almost brushed the walls. Damp stone glistened where moisture had seeped through over the centuries. Cobwebs hung untouched from the ceiling, except along a strip no wider than a man's shoulders. Someone had come this way recently. The electric torch lay where it had fallen. Hamish crouched beside it. A quality torch. Expensive. The batteries were still warm enough to suggest it had been dropped within the last few hours. He slipped it into his pocket. 10 yards farther on, the passage widened into a circular chamber carved into the rock beneath the castle. The room was empty, or almost. Dust covered the floor except for a large rectangular space in the center where something heavy had rested for years. Whatever had been there had recently been removed. Fresh scrape marks crossed the stone toward another doorway. So, Hamish said softly, Lugs, we've arrived too late. The dog ignored him. Instead, Lugs wandered to one corner of the chamber and began sniffing insistently. Hamish joined him. Hidden beneath loose rubble was a folded piece of paper, not ancient parchment, modern stationery. Someone had dropped it accidentally. He unfolded it carefully. It was part of an architectural survey. Most of the page consisted of measurements and diagrams. One sentence, however, had been circled heavily in blue ink. Possible concealed chamber beneath the grey chamber fireplace. Historical records indicate alterations during the Jacobite period. Written underneath in neat handwriting were 3 words. It's still there. No signature. No date. Hamish folded the paper and placed it beside the scarf in his pocket. The picture remained incomplete, but several pieces had begun to edge together. Lady Veronica had not bought the castle merely to restore it. She had been searching for the hidden chamber. Someone else had known about it first, and whatever had once occupied the center of this room had vanished before Hamish arrived. He examined the scrape marks again. They led through the second doorway. Beyond lay another passage descending toward the sea. Unlike the first, this tunnel ended abruptly at a heavy iron gate. The lock hung open. Outside, daylight shimmered across the water. A concealed exit, large enough for a person carrying a heavy object, or several people. Hamish stepped onto the narrow ledge beyond. Far below, waves smashed against the cliffs. Halfway down the rock face, almost invisible from above, was a tiny landing where a boat could tie up at high tide. He smiled to himself. The receipt from Portree suddenly made much more sense. Someone had been using the sea entrance for quite some time. When Hamish emerged from the hidden passage, Adrian Pierce was waiting in the grey chamber. So, Pierce said pleasantly, find anything interesting? Hamish yawned. Mostly dust. Pierce searched his face. I thought you were inside for rather a long time. I've always been slow, so people say. Hamish nodded. They're usually right. Pierce's eyes drifted briefly toward the fireplace. Only for a second. But it was enough. He knew about the concealed door. Yet he made no attempt to glance directly at it. A man unfamiliar with the room would have looked around in curiosity. Pierce carefully avoided doing so. That interested Hamish far more than any hidden tunnel. As they descended the staircase together, Lady Veronica hurried toward them. Well? Hamish shrugged. I've seen older buildings. That's all? No ghosts? None introduced themselves. She looked dissatisfied. Pierce, by contrast, appeared quietly relieved. That evening, Lockdow held its weekly gathering at the hotel bar. Officially, people came for a drink. Unofficially, they came to exchange information while pretending not to gossip. Hamish sat in his usual corner with coffee instead of whiskey. From there he could watch the room without appearing to. Lady Veronica occupied a table near the fire with Adrian Pierce and the other two visitors. They spoke in low voices. Every few minutes Lady Veronica glanced toward the windows as though expecting someone, not fearing someone. Expecting. Elspeth Grant slipped into the empty chair opposite Hamish. I've news. So have I. You first. Ladies first. She rolled her eyes. I've been speaking to the solicitor who handled the castle sale. Oh, he says Lady Veronica wasn't the only bidder. Hamish looked up. Who else wanted it? He doesn't know. He must. He signed a confidentiality agreement. Hamish smiled faintly. Which means he does. Elspeth nodded. He let one thing slip. What? The other buyer offered considerably more money. But lost? Lady Veronica completed the purchase faster. Hamish stirred his coffee thoughtfully. So someone wanted the castle badly. Very badly. She leaned closer. Your turn. Hamish told her nothing about the hidden chamber. Instead he asked, did you ever hear of a Fiona Macrae, the daughter of Isabel? You know her? Not personally. Where is she now? Elspeth frowned. I think she left Scotland years ago. England? No. Canada, perhaps? She thought for another moment. No. Wait. Recognition dawned. Australia. Hamish nodded slowly. And she's never come back. Not that anyone knows. Interesting. Very interesting. The hotel door burst open with enough force to silence every conversation. A man stumbled inside, soaked to the skin and breathing hard. It was Donald Macrae, the shepherd whose sheep Lady Veronica had criticized. Constable! Hamish stood immediately. What is it? Donald struggled for breath. I've found somebody. Where? Near the old watchman's cottage. Who? I don't know. Alive? Donald swallowed. I don't think so. The room fell silent. Even Lady Veronica had risen from her chair. Outside, the wind had begun to rise once more, carrying the first cold drops of another Highland storm. Hamish picked up his waterproof. Show me. Donald hesitated. His face had gone almost white. There's something else. What? He was dressed. Donald glanced uneasily toward Lady Veronica before looking back at Hamish. Like the Grey Lady. A murmur swept through the bar. The Grey Lady. The legendary ghost of Dunvegan Castle. Hamish said nothing. Ghosts did not concern him. Dead bodies did. And he had the distinct feeling that, before the night was over, the legends surrounding Dunvegan Castle were about to collide with something far more dangerous than folklore. Hamish followed Donald Macrae into the gathering darkness without another word. Lugs trotted ahead. His ears pricked against the strengthening wind. Behind them came the unmistakable sound of a car door slamming. Hamish glanced over his shoulder. Lady Veronica's Land Rover had pulled onto the road. Adrian Pierce sat beside her. The other two men occupied the back seats. They're following us, Donald muttered. Aye. Should they be? They'll come whether I invite them or not. The road climbed away from Lockdow, before narrowing into a rough track that wound through heather and scattered pines. Rain drifted across the moor in fine silver sheets, and the ruined outline of the old watchman's cottage gradually emerged from the gloom. It had once guarded the estate road to Dunvegan Castle. Now only 2 walls and half a chimney remained. Donald slowed. I found him over there. He pointed toward a shallow hollow beyond the cottage. Hamish motioned for everyone else to stay back. Lugs padded quietly beside him. The body lay on its side among wet bracken. For one absurd moment Hamish understood why Donald had mentioned the Grey Lady. The figure wore a long grey cloak, its hood pulled over the head. Wind tugged at the fabric, making it ripple eerily in the fading light. But ghosts did not wear modern hiking boots. Hamish knelt. The cloak was soaked with rain. Beneath it lay the body of a man in his late 50s, clean-shaven, grey-haired, respectably dressed. A deep wound marked the side of his head. Not much blood remained. The rain had carried most of it into the earth. Hamish touched the man's wrist. Cold, very cold, dead for several hours. He carefully drew back the hood. Lady Veronica gave a sharp gasp behind him. No. Hamish looked up. You know him? She stared at the face, visibly shaken. His name is Richard Fenwick. Who was he? My historical consultant. You employed him? Yes. Pierce stepped forward. He was an expert in Jacobite architecture. Hamish noticed the wording. Not is, was. No surprise. But Pierce had answered too quickly. You expected him to be here? Hamish asked. Lady Veronica hesitated. He disappeared yesterday. You reported him missing? No. Why not? I assumed he'd gone back to Inverness. Hamish said nothing. People who assumed things generally had reasons for doing so. He examined the body again. The grey cloak appeared far older than the clothing beneath it. Its coarse wool smelled faintly of damp stone and peat smoke. Certainly not something Fenwick would normally wear. Someone had dressed him after death, or shortly before it. Lugs sniffed around the body before wandering several yards away. The dog stopped beside a cluster of rocks and barked once. Hamish joined him. Half hidden beneath heather lay a broken lantern, old-fashioned. Its glass smashed. Fresh mud coated one side. He looked around carefully. The ground had become a confusion of footprints. Donald's, his own, Lady Veronica's group. But beneath them all remained older impressions left before the rain. One set belonged to heavy work boots, another to narrower shoes. A third, he frowned, bare feet. Someone had walked across the wet earth without shoes. Not recently, before the storm had washed most of the detail away. Odd, very odd. The distant wail of a police siren drifted across the hills. Donald looked surprised. They're here quickly. They were already on the road. A few minutes later, 2 Strathbane police vehicles bounced onto the track. The first door flew open before the engine had stopped. Detective Chief Inspector Blair climbed out in magnificent ill temper. He surveyed the rain, the mud, the ruined cottage, and finally Hamish. Oh, splendid! His face reddened almost instantly. I leave you alone for 5 minutes, and you produce another corpse. It wasn't intentional. You Highland idiot. Blair splashed through a puddle. What have you done? Looked at him? I can see you've looked at him. Blair turned toward his detectives. Keep Macbeth away from everything. One of the younger detectives coughed politely. Sir, he's the first officer at the scene. I don't care if he's the Archbishop of Canterbury. Blair jabbed a finger toward Hamish. He contaminates investigations simply by existing. Hamish accepted the insult with his customary calm. Experience had taught him that contradicting Blair merely extended the performance. Blair crouched beside the body. Identification? Richard Fenwick, Lady Veronica's answered. Blair stood immediately. You know him? He worked for me. Blair smiled broadly. Excellent. Lady Veronica blinked. I beg your pardon. That gives us somewhere to begin. Hamish silently felt sorry for her. Blair had found the nearest convenient suspect. He rarely looked beyond the first one. The detectives photographed the scene while Blair demanded increasingly impatient answers. When did you last see him? Yesterday morning. You argued. No. Witnesses? I don't know. Money involved? Of course. Blair nodded triumphantly. There we are. Lady Veronica stared in disbelief. I haven't admitted anything. You've admitted motive. Hamish wandered quietly toward the ruined cottage, while Blair continued bullying his witnesses. Nobody tried to stop him. After all, everyone expected him merely to get underfoot. Inside the roofless building, rain dripped steadily through broken beams. The floor consisted mostly of damp earth and scattered stones. Lugs sniffed along one wall, before scratching at a loose floor slab. Hamish lifted it. Beneath lay nothing more sinister than an old tobacco tin. Inside the tin rested several folded pages, wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Not recent. The paper had yellowed with age. He unfolded the first sheet. It contained neat handwritten notes, not 18th century writing. Modern. Richard Fenwick's name appeared at the top. Below it were sketches of the hidden chamber beneath the grey chamber. Detailed sketches, far more detailed than the architectural survey Hamish had already found. Several passages had been underlined. One sentence caught his attention immediately. The chamber appears to have housed a carved oak chest, removed sometime within the last fortnight. Another note followed beneath. Someone else has already found it. Hamish's expression remained unchanged. Someone else. Not Lady Veronica. Not Fenwick. Someone ahead of both of them. He folded the papers back into the tin, just as Blair's booming voice echoed from outside. "Macbeth!" Hamish replaced the slab exactly as before. "Aye? What are you doing in there?" "Keeping dry." Blair marched into the cottage, splashing mud everywhere. "You call this investigating?" "I was looking." "At what?" "The floor." Blair snorted. "The murderer isn't hiding under a rock." "No." "Then stop behaving like a village idiot and leave proper police work to professionals." "As you say." Blair stormed away again. Hamish watched him disappear through the rain. Then he quietly slipped the tobacco tin inside his waterproof jacket. Some discoveries were best kept to oneself, especially when Blair was nearby. As the body was prepared for removal, Hamish looked once more toward Dunvegan Castle. One fact had become impossible to ignore. Richard Fenwick had written that the mysterious oak chest had vanished within the last fortnight. Yet Lady Veronica had only owned the castle for 6 days, which meant whoever had taken it had entered the hidden chamber before she ever arrived. And if Fenwick had discovered that secret, it was entirely possible that the knowledge had just cost him his life. The rain stopped shortly after midnight, leaving the Highlands wrapped in a damp, uneasy silence. Hamish did not return to the police station immediately. Instead, he stood outside the ruined watchman's cottage, while the ambulance disappeared down the track, with Richard Fenwick's body. DCI Blair was still barking orders. "Interview every workman. And somebody get me the estate records." One of the detectives ventured cautiously. "Sir? Should we search the castle tonight?" Blair looked toward the black silhouette of Dunvegan Castle looming above the cliffs. "In this weather?" "No, sir." "Exactly." Hamish smiled to himself. By morning, if someone wished to remove evidence from the castle, they would have nearly 10 uninterrupted hours. Blair was obligingly giving them the opportunity. "Macbeth." Hamish turned. "What?" "Report to me at 8. "Aye. And stay away from the castle." "As you wish." Blair climbed into his car without waiting for a reply. The convoy rumbled away. Within minutes the moor belonged once more to the wind and the sheep. Instead of heading home, Hamish walked toward the castle. Lugs seemed entirely in favor of the decision. The moon broke through ragged clouds, casting enough light to reveal the narrow estate road. Everything smelled freshly washed. Heather. Wet stone. Salt from the sea. As he approached the castle grounds, he stopped. There were lights inside, not many. One downstairs, another high in the western tower. Hamish frowned. Lady Veronica had dismissed the builders hours ago. She herself was staying at the hotel. No one should have been inside. He crossed the lawn quietly. The front entrance remained locked. He expected that. Instead, he circled toward the concealed stair leading down to the old boathouse. Halfway there he heard voices. A man. Then another. Too distant to distinguish words. Hamish crouched behind a clump of gorse. 3 figures emerged from the darkness carrying lanterns, not electric torches, old hurricane lamps, whose light could not easily be seen from a distance. The first man was Adrian Pierce. The second was one of the strangers who had arrived with him. The third wore a hooded waterproof, too bulky to identify. They disappeared toward the cliff path leading to the hidden sea entrance. Hamish waited until their lanterns vanished. Then he followed. The concealed tunnel beneath the castle echoed faintly with voices. He remained in darkness near the entrance. "Must still be here," someone whispered. "It isn't," Fenwick said. "Fenwick is dead." Silence. Then Adrian Pierce spoke. "We're wasting time," the hooded figure answered. "You promised it hadn't been moved." "I promised nothing." "What about Veronica?" "She knows only what she needs to know." Hamish felt a faint tightening in his chest. Interesting. Very interesting. Lady Veronica, despite appearances, might not be directing events after all. A scraping sound echoed through the tunnel. Someone was moving stones. Several minutes passed. Finally Pierce spoke again. "Nothing. It has to exist." "Then someone found it before us." The hooded figure swore quietly. "We leave. Now." Footsteps approached. Hamish slipped farther back into the darkness. The 3 figures emerged from the passage carrying nothing. As they climbed toward the castle, the hood slipped briefly from the third person's head. Moonlight caught pale hair. A woman. Not Lady Veronica. Not Elspeth. Someone Hamish had never seen before. She walked with a slight limp. His memory stirred. The unknown woman Mrs. McLean had seen arguing with Lady Veronica. The woman Archie had watched standing beside the harbour. The woman who had left flowers on Isabel McRae's grave. At last, he had seen her face. only for a heartbeat, but enough to recognize her again. The following morning, Blair transformed the village hall into an improvised headquarters. Maps covered the walls. Detectives hurried back and forth, carrying notebooks. Blair himself looked as though he had slept even less than usual. He glared at Hamish. Late. It's 5 minutes. It's late. Hamish accepted this without argument. Blair pointed toward a chair. Sit. Lady Veronica sat opposite, looking pale but composed. Adrian Pierce stood beside the window. The other two visitors had vanished. Blair opened a file dramatically. Miss Veronica Ashcombe. Lady Veronica. I don't care if you're the Queen. He slapped the folder. Your employee is dead. Yes. You failed to report him missing. Yes. You argued over money. No. Blair looked disappointed. No. We argued about history. Blair blinked. History. He believed the castle contained documents of national importance. And? I believed he was chasing legends. Blair frowned. What sort of documents? Fenwick's name had appeared repeatedly in newspapers over the years. Hamish remembered reading one article. The man specialized in Jacobite correspondence, old letters, private diaries, records hidden after the failed uprising. Lady Veronica answered quietly. He believed someone concealed a collection of Jacobite papers beneath the castle. Blair looked baffled. Why would anyone kill over old bits of paper? Hamish, standing quietly near the back wall, thought he knew. Some historical documents were worth fortunes. Others could change reputations. Occasionally, both. Lady Veronica continued. Richard thought they'd survived, because everyone searched for treasure. But no one searched for papers. Blair scratched his head. I still don't see. A detective entered hurriedly. Sir, what now? We've identified the cloak. Blair straightened. Well, it belongs to the castle. What? It was displayed in a glass case. Lady Veronica looked startled. It was part of the collection. The detective nodded. The display case has been forced open. Blair smiled broadly. There we are. Hamish recognized that smile. Blair believed the case was nearly solved. The murderer steals the cloak. He counted on thick fingers. Kills Fenwick, dresses him as a ghost, and frightens everyone away from the castle. He looked triumphantly around the room. It's obvious. Nobody else appeared quite so convinced. Hamish certainly wasn't, because Blair had overlooked one awkward fact. If the cloak had been stolen from inside the castle, after Lady Veronica bought it, how had the mysterious woman been seen wandering the estate several days before anyone knew a ghost was supposed to exist? The legend had not been created to hide the murder. Someone had been deliberately encouraging ghost stories long before Richard Fenwick died, which meant the murder was part of a much older plan. Before Hamish could consider the matter further, Elspeth Grant appeared breathless in the doorway. She ignored Blair completely. Hamish! Blair's face turned crimson. I'm conducting an official interview. I know. Elspeth looked only at Hamish. I've found Fiona McRae. The room fell silent. Hamish asked the obvious question. In Australia? No. Where then? Elspeth swallowed. She's been living less than 20 miles from Lockdow. Hamish stared at her. Under another name. And? Elspeth lowered her voice. I've just seen her. Where? She looked toward Lady Veronica. At Dunvegan Castle. Hamish did not react. Years of dealing with DCI Blair had taught him that surprise was best kept private. Blair, unfortunately, had never learned the same lesson. What? He barked. Elspeth looked from Blair to Hamish. The woman I saw at the castle is Fiona McRae. You're certain? Yes. How? I interviewed her 15 years ago. That caught Hamish's attention. You never mentioned it. You never asked. A faint smile crossed his face. He had used exactly the same answer on Archie the fisherman. Blair slammed a hand onto the table. Who is this woman? Lady Veronica answered quietly. The daughter of Isabel McRae. I know that much, Blair snapped. Why is she important? Elspeth took a notebook from her satchel. Because she isn't calling herself Fiona McRae anymore. What name is she using? She hesitated. Helen Fraser. The name meant nothing to Blair. To Hamish? It meant very little. But names were rarely important. People were. When did you recognize her? Hamish asked. This morning. Where? Outside the castle. Was she alone? No. With whom? Adrian Pierce. Lady Veronica turned sharply toward Pierce. You told me you'd never met her. Pierce remained perfectly calm. I hadn't. You were speaking together. For the first time. About what? I've no idea who she is. His answer came smoothly. Too smoothly. Hamish noticed something else. Pierce did not appear surprised that Fiona McRae was alive. Only irritated that someone else had identified her. That distinction mattered. Blair puffed out his chest. Excellent. Everyone looked at him. We've found our mysterious woman. He pointed dramatically toward the door. Bring her in. A detective cleared his throat. Sir, what? We don't know where she is. Blair's expression collapsed. Then find her. The detectives hurried out with obvious relief. An hour later, Hamish escaped headquarters under the pretense of checking road closures. Blair barely looked up. Be back by lunchtime. If I remember. You'd better. Hamish walked toward the harbour. Lugs trotted contentedly beside him. The village appeared unchanged. Children cycled along the waterfront. Mrs. Wellington argued with her geese. Tourists photographed fishing boats. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm, tension lingered. Lockdow always knew when trouble had settled among it. Archie McBride was mending nets. Without looking up, he said, You're after the woman again. Aye. You've just missed her. Hamish sat beside him. Which one? The one with the limp. When? 10 minutes ago. Where'd she go? The old lighthouse. Hamish looked across the loch. The abandoned lighthouse stood on a rocky point beyond the castle road. Hardly anyone visited it now. Was she alone? Archie shook his head. She met another fellow. What sort? Older? Local? No. Did you hear anything? Only one sentence. What was it? Archie finally looked up. He told her? He found the chamber too late. Hamish felt his thoughts quicken. Not they. He. Someone was being discussed. Richard Fenwick. Or someone else. The path to the lighthouse followed the cliffs before descending through wind-bent pines. The sea glittered beneath a pale afternoon sun. Lugs suddenly stopped. His ears flattened. Hamish looked ahead. Fresh tire marks crossed the grass. A vehicle had left the road recently. He followed them. They ended behind a stand of gorse where a dark SUV had been carefully concealed beneath camouflage netting. Not local. No registration plates. The engine was cold. Inside lay waterproof clothing, climbing ropes, and several empty wooden crates. Professional equipment. Not treasure hunters. Not tourists. Someone had come prepared. Hamish examined the rear compartment. One crate still contained fragments of packing straw. Nestled among them lay a tiny piece of carved oak. He picked it up. The craftsmanship was exquisite. Old. Very old. One edge had splintered recently. His thoughts returned immediately to Fenwick's note. A carved oak chest. The fragment matched perfectly. Someone had already broken the chest apart. But why? To carry it more easily. Or because they wanted only what had been inside. He slipped the fragment into his pocket. Lugs barked once. Voices drifted from the lighthouse. Hamish approached quietly. The heavy wooden door stood slightly open. Inside, footsteps echoed up the spiral staircase. He climbed slowly. Near the top, he heard a woman speaking. I told you it wasn't there. Fiona McRae. Another voice answered. Older, male. You overlooked something. I searched every inch. So did Fenwick. And look what happened to him. Silence. The older man spoke again. If Pierce reaches it first, we're finished. Hamish leaned slightly around the curve of the staircase. The lantern room came into view. Fiona McRae stood beside the windows. Opposite her was a thin, elderly man with silver hair and wire-rimmed spectacles. He looked more like a retired professor than a criminal. Between them lay several yellowed maps, spread across a wooden table. One map clearly showed Dunvegan Castle. The older man tapped a finger against the paper. The tunnel. It leads nowhere. Not anymore. What do you mean? It wasn't built to reach the sea. Fiona frowned. It was built to protect something. Hamish remained perfectly still. The old man continued. The sea entrance was added later. Fiona stared at the map. Then where did the original tunnel go? The elderly man smiled faintly. That's the question Richard finally answered. Before Fiona could reply, a floorboard creaked beneath Hamish's boot. Both heads turned instantly. For one frozen second nobody moved. Then Fiona shouted, Someone's here. The old man snatched the maps. Hamish abandoned any pretense of stealth. He bounded up the remaining stairs. The elderly man darted toward a narrow maintenance ladder leading onto the lighthouse roof. Fiona fled in the opposite direction. Hamish had only a heartbeat to choose. He chose the older man. Anyone willing to risk murder was important. He scrambled after him onto the narrow gallery circling the lighthouse lantern. The wind hit like a wall. The old man ran surprisingly fast for his age. Halfway around the gallery, he slipped on rain-slick iron. The bundle of maps flew from his hands. Pages scattered into the air like startled birds. Hamish lunged. He caught the man by the sleeve just as he struck the railing. For a terrifying moment, both of them teetered above the rocks nearly 100 feet below. The old man looked into Hamish's eyes. There was fear there, but also resignation. "You don't understand," he whispered. "No? If they find it." His sentence ended abruptly. A sharp crack echoed across the cliffs. The old man's body jerked violently. His eyes widened in astonishment. Then he collapsed against Hamish. For a heartbeat, Hamish simply stared. The man had been shot. Not from the lighthouse. From somewhere outside. Somewhere across the cliffs. A sniper had been waiting. The old man's weight nearly pulled Hamish over the railing. He tightened his grip instinctively, dragging the wounded man back onto the narrow gallery as another gust of wind lashed the lighthouse. Lugs barked furiously from somewhere below. There was no second shot. Whoever had fired knew better than to linger. Hamish lowered the old man gently onto the iron grating. "Stay with me." The man managed a weak smile. "It wasn't supposed." His voice faded into a ragged cough. Hamish leaned closer. "Who?" The old man struggled for breath. "Pierce doesn't know." "Know what?" "The papers." His hand closed weakly around Hamish's sleeve. "Not treasure." Then the strength went out of him. Hamish remained kneeling for a moment before quietly closing the man's eyes. He looked toward the distant hills. The shot had been clean, professional. Not the act of someone panicking. Someone had come to silence a man who knew too much. By the time DCI Blair arrived, accompanied by enough detectives to invade a small country, the lighthouse had become another crime scene. Blair's face had achieved an alarming shade of crimson. "2 bodies!" He rounded on Hamish. "2 bodies! In as many days!" Hamish nodded. "It does seem excessive. Where is the woman?" "Gone." "You let her escape?" "I was occupied." "With what?" Hamish looked pointedly at the dead man. Blair harumphed. One of the detectives approached. "Sir, we've identified him." "Well?" "Professor Malcolm Havers." Blair frowned. "Should I know who that is?" "A historian." Hamish recognized the name. Havers had written respected books on Jacobite Scotland decades earlier, before disappearing from public life. A scholar, not a treasure hunter. That mattered. It also fitted Richard Fenwick's obsession with historical documents. Not gold, papers, letters, records. The hidden oak chest had never been valuable because of what it was made of. It had been valuable because of what it contained. That evening, Hamish sat alone in the police station. The carved fragment of oak rested on his desk beside the green silk scarf, Fenwick's notes, and the architectural survey. Lugs slept by the stove. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows once more. Hamish spread the clues through his mind. Lady Veronica had bought the castle believing it concealed a legendary treasure. Richard Fenwick had discovered that the treasure was, in reality, a cache of Jacobite correspondence hidden centuries before. Professor Havers had known the same secret. Someone else had reached the hidden chamber first. Someone who removed the oak chest before Lady Veronica ever arrived. The chest had later been broken apart. Only the papers mattered. The scarf, the unknown woman, Fiona McRae, the grave, the ghost. One detail refused to leave him. Fiona had placed flowers on her mother's grave before returning to the castle. Not after. Before. As though she had finally come home. Home. Hamish suddenly sat upright. Home. He reached for the village register. Years ago, Isabel McRae had served as housekeeper at Dunvegan Castle. Her daughter Fiona had grown up there. She had played in its corridors, hidden passages, secret rooms, long before Lady Veronica, long before Fenwick, long before Adrian Pierce. She had known the castle all her life. She hadn't returned searching blindly. She had returned because she already knew where to look. But if Fiona knew, why had she been searching with Professor Havers? Unless she hadn't found the papers. Someone had taken them before she could. Someone who learnt the secret from Richard Fenwick. Someone who had watched Hamish inside the hidden passage. Someone who calmly lied to everyone. Adrian Pierce. Hamish did not arrest Pierce. That would have warned him. Instead, he visited Mrs. McLean. "I've a favor." She smiled knowingly. "I thought you might." An hour later, every respectable gossip in Lochdu had heard the same remarkable story. Hamish Macbeth had discovered a hidden compartment beneath the grey chamber. Inside, according to reliable sources, rested the missing Jacobite papers. The castle would be searched officially at first light. By midnight, the rumor had undoubtedly reached Adrian Pierce. That was exactly the point. Hamish returned quietly to Dunvegan Castle. Lugs accompanied him. They waited inside the grey chamber, With every lamp extinguished, hours passed. The old castle groaned softly around them. Finally, a faint click echoed behind the panel. Someone entered the hidden passage from the sea entrance. Not cautiously, confidently. Certain the room would be empty. Hamish remained motionless. The figure emerged carrying an electric lantern. Adrian Pierce. Alone, he crossed directly to the fireplace. Without hesitation, he reached inside a carved recess. Not searching, knowing. His fingers disappeared into a narrow cavity Hamish had overlooked. Pierce smiled. So, there you are. He withdrew a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Letters, old papers. Exactly as Professor Havers had described. Hamish stepped from the darkness. Evening. Pierce froze. His expression remained calm for perhaps 2 seconds. Then it hardened. You started that ridiculous rumor. I did. There was never another search planned. No. Pierce laughed quietly. Clever. I've been called worse. Pierce looked toward the concealed passage. Then toward the doorway, calculating. You've no proof. Hamish nodded toward the bundle. I've enough. You don't understand what these are. Jacobite papers. They're worth millions. Perhaps. Pierce shook his head. They rewrite history. So Professor Havers believed. And Fenwick. What about you? Pierce's smile disappeared. They'd spent years chasing fairy tales. They found the truth. They found something that belonged to me. Hamish raised an eyebrow. Did it? My grandfather discovered references to these papers before the war. Our family financed every search. So murder became an investment. Pierce's face tightened. Fenwick refused to hand them over. So you killed him. He slipped. Hamish said nothing. Pierce sighed. I only wanted the papers. And Professor Havers. He recognized me. And the sniper? Pierce's silence lasted just a fraction too long. That was answer enough. Without warning, Pierce threw the heavy lantern. Hamish ducked. The glass shattered against the wall. Oil burst across the ancient floor. Pierce sprinted toward the hidden passage. Lugs exploded after him with astonishing speed. The dog caught Pierce halfway down the tunnel, clamping firmly onto his sleeve. Pierce stumbled. Hamish reached him 3 strides later. The struggle was brief but violent. Pierce landed hard against the stone wall, the bundle of Jacobite papers scattering across the floor. When it was over, he sat breathing heavily, handcuffed, staring bitterly at Hamish. You were never the fool they said. Hamish smiled faintly. I've found it useful letting folk think so. Fiona McCrae emerged the following morning. She voluntarily gave Blair a full statement. She admitted searching the castle with Professor Havers, but denied any involvement in either murder. Every piece of evidence supported her account. Richard Fenwick had discovered the hidden chamber. Pierce had followed him there, believing Fenwick had already found the papers. When Fenwick refused to surrender his research, Pierce struck him with a heavy lantern, killing him accidentally. To hide both the crime and his continued search, he dressed the body in the Grey Lady's cloak, hoping fear and superstition would keep everyone away from the castle. Professor Havers later uncovered enough of the truth to become a danger himself. Pierce arranged for him to be silenced before he could reveal where the papers were hidden. The letters themselves had never left the castle. During the confusion, Pierce had concealed them inside an overlooked cavity carved into the fireplace mantel, intending to retrieve them once Blair abandoned the investigation. He had underestimated one thing: Hamish Macbeth's patience. Blair accepted congratulations from headquarters with magnificent dignity. He held a press conference in Strathbane, describing months of careful detective work, despite the entire investigation lasting only a few days. Nobody in Lockdow felt inclined to correct him, certainly not Hamish. The chief constable praised Blair's leadership. Promotion was mentioned, for Blair, not Hamish, exactly as Hamish preferred. When Blair later grumbled that Macbeth was almost useful for once, Hamish merely agreed. Aye, sir. It cost him nothing. A week later, the Highlands settled back into their familiar rhythm. Lady Veronica quietly abandoned her extravagant redevelopment plans. The Jacobite papers were entrusted to the proper historical authorities, who regarded them as one of the most significant archival discoveries in generations. Fiona McCrae remained in Lockdow long enough to place fresh flowers on her mother's grave. This time, she did not hide. The villagers, having learnt the full story, left her in peace. One clear afternoon, Hamish sat outside the Lockdow Hotel with a large mug of coffee, while Lugs dozed contentedly at his feet. Mrs. McLean emerged carrying a fresh plate of scones. Quiet again. Aye. You'll miss the excitement. I doubt it. She smiled. So Blair got all the credit. He was welcome to it. You could have had a promotion. Hamish looked across the loch toward the mist-softened outline of Dunvegan Castle. A pair of gulls wheeled overhead. Somewhere in the hills, sheep complained about nothing in particular. Lochdew was exactly as it should be. He lifted his coffee. "I've already got everything I want." Mrs. McLean laughed. "I suppose that's why you'll never leave." Hamish watched the wind ripple across the dark water. "No," he said contentedly. "I suppose I never will."